everyone, welcome to my channel and welcome to the third video of the video series My Jacket Pattern Rebecca in different fur styles. If you haven't watched the other two videos yet, I link them for you here. So this third fur Rebecca is quite dramatic, and the plan to make this jacket is quite old because last winter around the beginning of this year, I found a gorgeous fake fur on Bulgarian fabrics, which really looked so realistic, and I've got the idea to make a chic evening jacket. This is in fact really something that my wardrobe missed before. So let me just quickly talk about Bulgarian fabrics, because this is a fabric seller which sells designer deadstock fabrics. They are based in France. So as a deadstock fabric seller, you can imagine Bulgarian fabrics doesn't always have all the items or the same items in their shop. It also highly depends on the season. So if you'd like to buy some luxurious fake fur products, now it's the time for doing this. This video isn't sponsored by them, but I still have my code there, which is active. So if you'd like to, you can use this code, Koba.Siani 20, to save 20% on your first order there. And of course, especially if you're looking for fur, be quick, because later in spring it will be sold out. At the same time, this means of course also that if you're looking for more summery fabrics, you have to wait a few months to find them there. Okay, so now back to the jacket project. I myself, I'm not very experienced in working with fur fabrics. So before beginning with this project, I had to look around in the internet a little bit to look for some tips for sewing with this fabric. So this video isn't only about the idea how to make the fur jacket out of my jacket pattern Rebecca, but also a compilation of all the fur workmanship tricks I found on YouTube and on the internet. I've tried them almost all, and I must say that working with fake fur is not the most easiest fabric, of course, but I managed to do it. I've also tried working only with the tools I've already had at home, and I've not bought anything new for working with the fur. Design-wise, I had this silhouette or idea in my mind, so that means I've used the long version of the Rebecca jacket with the round neck. But unlike here, I've also added the small knit collar to my version of the fur jacket. So here is now the good piece. As you can see, the fur fabric is really quite thick. So the jacket is really very voluminous. I don't know if I would wear this when I go grocery shopping or doing some normal everyday things, but I've already worn it for going out, and I really like my outfit. Look here, I've worn it together with my winter evening layer dress, and I really loved my outfit. Both patterns, of course, the layer dress and the Rebecca jacket, which you will need for this jacket here, you will find in all my shops. The links you will find below in the description box. Again, like for the teddy fur with the Leo print Rebecca jacket, there are some small pattern adaptations needed, but in general they are just the same as for this jacket here. But of course I'll also explain these in this video here. I just wanted to say this because both jackets really look very different. But if you look on the pattern construction, they are really quite similar, only the lengths are different. And there's also another difference, because here with this very thick fur jacket, I don't have an overlapping here in the center front, unlike for the other Rebecca jacket where I have an overlapping with buttons. But this also I'll explain later in the video. Okay, enough talked. Let's start in this fun and also a bit physically exhausting sewing project. Have fun! Before cutting into your fur, the first thing you have to check is the grain direction of the fur, because the hair should be pointing downwards later when the jacket is ready. While keeping the direction, I turn around the fur now, as the cutting work will be done from the wrong fabric side. Another thing that I've learned online is that you cannot cut fur with a fold. You always have to cut one layer only. And this time also, because I was so scared to cut into my expensive fur. And with the pattern adaptations, I decided to draw on the pattern pieces at first and then cut them. So at first you saw me drawing a straight line for the center back. Then I fix the back pattern piece along that line, and then I draw on the cutting lines. As already mentioned, the pattern adaptations are quite similar to the Leo teddy fur jacket. Means here in the main fabric I've added 1 centimeter along the neckline, 2 centimeter along the hemline, and additionally I wanted the hem to be straight, so I've eliminated the rounding at the side seam. Then the pattern piece is flipped over, fixed again with pins along the center back line, and then the other side of the back pattern piece can be drawn on the fabric. Of course, with the same adaptations as the first side. As I couldn't fit the front pattern pieces beside the back, I continued then with the sleeves. Here again, 2 cm at the hemline have to be added. The Rebecca sleeves, by the way, are symmetrical, so here you don't have to flip the pattern. The pockets need 1 cm more for the seam allowance all around. The front pattern pieces I've drawn on above the back pattern pieces, and here I applied again the same rule as for the Leo teddy fur jacket. Means I've added 2 cm for the hem and 1 cm along the front edge and the neckline. But this is something I would have to correct, but I show you later. Nothing too dramatic though. Again, I've eliminated the roundings at the hem, at the side seam and the center front. To get a pair of front pieces, I then flipped around the pattern piece to draw on the second front piece. Of course, again with the same adaptations. After all these preparations, it's finally time to cut into the fabric. But here I don't just cut straight away, I cut with a special technique so that the hair doesn't get cut, only the woven backing of the fabric. So I move my scissor blades only a little bit. I open them only enough to cut the woven part of the fur fabric. You could also cut, by the way, the fabric with a sharp cutter and cut with it also only the woven backing of the fabric, but I preferred it with my scissors. When you then pull the fabric apart, you see that the hair is not damaged. This is our aim, and only the woven part is cut. Here in this close-up you can see again how I move my scissors. I open the blades really very little only, and the lower blade should be guided along the woven backing. The cutting process with this technique is very slow, of course, but it's really worth it. With this technique also fewer hair is flying around in your working space, but nevertheless, after cutting out all the fur pieces, I cleaned my room first. As a lining, I chose this satin with a cute palm print, which is also, by the way, from Beglarian Fabrics, but I thought it was a little bit too thin, so I decided to add a soft interfacing over all the lining pattern pieces. And to make things easier, I've cut the pattern pieces out of the interfacing at first, and here again some pattern adaptations have to be done. At the back part, I add again 1 cm along the neckline, but at the hem, I cut along the original hemline. I only eliminate the curves and cut the hem straight. At the front lining, I also add 1 cm along the neckline and the front edge, like for the outer fabric. But again, I cut along the original hemline and only cut no curves, but in straight lines and angles. The sleeves are cut with their original outline, and at the pockets again I add 1 cm all around. As soon as the interfacing is ironed onto the wrong fabric side of the lining, I can cut out the fabric without the satin always slipping away. At this point, I finally understood that such thick fur jackets cannot have an overlapping at the front edge. This would be much too thick. So the ready front edges should just meet at the center front and should be closed by a hook and eye. This is why I'm cutting now off the overlapping on the lining and also on the main fabric pieces. At the lining I can cut both layers at the same time, and the fur I'm cutting separately again. In case of the Rebecca jacket, these are 1.5 cm which have to be cut. The knit collar I had already cut out, but here also I have to adjust something because of the different workmanship. On both long edges I have to remove 1 centimeter. Means the collar gets now smaller than the original collar, but not shorter. The collar notches are still important, of course, and can be drawn on with the original pattern piece. Then I started sewing the lining, at first the shoulders, then came the sleeves, and at last I closed the side seams and the sleeve seams. Of course, all seam allowances have to be pressed apart after sewing, and don't forget to leave a turning opening in one of the side seams. I was really scared with my big fur that my opening would be too small, so I left almost the whole side seam open. I only closed the small curve at the top after the sleeve seam, and at the bottom also a few centimeters. Then I pinned the knit collar right side to right side, of course, to the neck hole of the lining. Additionally to the notches at the center back and shoulder seams, I then took care that the center front is done nicely. Here I draw on the seam crossings at the center front on both pattern pieces, means collar and front pattern piece. These are marked in red here, so that I could pin both seam line crossings on top of each other. With our seam allowance of 1 centimeter, these red lines are 1 centimeter away from the fabric edge. Then it was time to make the pockets. And as you can see it here, just putting both fabrics with their right fabric sides together is really difficult with this long, thick fur. For this problem, I found the following tip. I've applied it for all the fur seams and I found it really helpful. And the tip is to cut off the hair on the seam allowances. It was quite good to practice this on this less important area, because at first I cut off a little bit too much, but luckily it wasn't visible later. Then I could pin the lining pattern piece onto the fur, and whenever you pin the layers together, you have to take care that all the hair is laying to the inside. You can push the hair to the inside with your fingers or another tool. When the pocket pieces are sewn together, of course, we need to leave a turning opening so that the pocket can be turned around to the right fabric side. As this seam was only through one layer fur and the other layer was a thin fabric, it was not that hard to sew. But nevertheless, I practiced the next sewing tip for fur, and this is grab a tool and press your fur fabric down while sewing. This tool can be your scissors, but you can also use a thick knitting needle or a screwdriver. With this movement, pressing down the fabric, you help your sewing machine with the transport of the fabric so that the stitches are built nicely. Afterwards, of course, the corners had to be trimmed, and I also cut the seam allowance at the bottom of the pocket along the rounding. Here I cut around the half of the seam allowance. Then the pocket could be turned around to its right fabric side, and later I closed the opening with a hand stitch. I also wanted to sew on the pockets on the front panels by hand, but already when I tried to fix their positions with pins, I realized this is not at all possible with all the hair. I just couldn't measure this properly. Then I had the idea that I could do this from the wrong fabric side. So I've drawn on the whole pocket in its correct position with fabric chalk on the wrong fabric side. And then I used this line as a reference for sewing on my pocket. This might be a little bit unconventional, but surprisingly it worked very well. The shoulder seams then were my first real fur seams because they included 2 layers of fur. And from now on I applied the same technique for all seams. So at first I cut off the hair on the seam allowances. But be careful here, don't cut too much. With my 1 centimeter seam allowance, I rather cut around 7 to 8 millimeter because I was really scared to cut too much and that this would be visible later as a bald spot. When I'm pinning both layers with their furry side together, I'm taking care that all hair is pointing to the inside, and this I'm just doing with my fingers. And later, while sewing, I'm also pushing the hair back to the inside with my tool. And as you can see it here, My favorite one, which I've used for the whole jacket, was a screwdriver. With this, I'm also pushing the fabric down and under the sewing foot, but with 2 fur layers, I also pushed the fabric a lot with my left hand and pulled it also a bit backwards to help the sewing machine with the fabric transport. The layers were really thick and it was quite a lot of work to keep the seam allowance and to ensure a proper fabric transport. For all these seams, of course, I needed also a thicker needle. I used one in size 90. With fur, there is no pressing the seam allowances apart, but instead, you should pull out all hair out of the seam. Afterwards, the seam line should not be visible anymore. I'm doing this again with my screwdriver, but here again a thick knitting needle would be possible. Or I've seen also people using a brush for dogs to do this. With my technique to cut off the hair on the seam allowances, not many hair are trapped in the seam. So this step was done really quickly. Then I repeated these steps for all the other seams until the fur layer was sewn together. Then the lining can be added and the first linking seam between the 2 layers is the collar. The knit collar is now pinned right side to right side into the neck hole of the main fabric layer. And of course it's important again to take care of all the notches. And again at the center front edge, I pin the seam line crossings on top of each other like I've done it before for the lining. This collar linking seam starts and ends, by the way, at the same point exactly like the collar seam from before between the collar and the lining. And like with all fur involved seams, it's practical to have your pushing tool, for me it's my screwdriver, always on hand to push all the hair back into the garment, not only while pinning but also while sewing. Then both layers are linked along the collar. As a next step, we can sew the hem. At first, I'm pinning the fabric edges together, right side on right side of course, and the hair is already cut off the seam allowance on the fur. This I had done before. Just take care here that the side seams are meeting each other. Then I'm sewing the hem just across the jacket in a straight line. I think it highly depends on the fur, how long the hair is and how heavy it is. But at this point sewing was really challenging for me and I was really glad that the Rebecca jacket itself is really simple to sew. The only difficulties came from the fur. As always, don't forget to push in the hair to the inside of the garment. Here I'm again using my screwdriver. Then I continued with the front edge and the neckline. On the front edge, I pin both layers together and at the neckline, I put the seam allowances of the collar linking seams apart and then I pin the seam allowances which point into the jacket, means downwards, together. As for all seams, the hair on the seam allowance of the fur is already cut off. At the hemline, by the way, the seam line is tilted for 1 centimeter into the lining part, so that the lining won't show later when you are wearing the jacket. This is why we added 2 centimeter at the hemline of the main fabric and nothing at the hemline of the lining parts. The front edge is then sewn normally with 1 centimeter seam allowance. And as soon as you've reached the collar, you sew over the seam ends of the collar linking seams. And then in the collar, you only sew on the seam allowance, just beside the original collar linking seam. Please make sure that you don't sew in parts of the collar, because here you only sew through the seam allowance layers of the main fabric and the lining fabric. Then on the other side, you're continuing just like normal with the other front edge. Then the jacket is turned over to its right fabric side through the reversal opening. This is just the safest way to get the cuffs right, and I use this method every time I make a jacket with lining. At first I take the cuff and I fold both fabric edges towards their wrong fabric side and I pin the fabric like this. The best is you pin a spot near the sleeve seam. This doesn't have to be very exact. This pin will only help to get the right pinning position of the cuffs. And 1 pin is already enough. Then I pull out that cuff through the reversal opening and pin these fabric edges together properly. The first pin, which I've placed for orientation, is of course now removed. It only helped to pin lining and main fabric cuffs together in the correct position. As you can perhaps see now, the way how they are pinned together looks somehow wrong, and I always find it difficult to get it right without this one helping pin. Again, the hair on the seam allowance of the fur cuff I've already cut off before. At last I can close the cuffs all around with 1 cm seam allowance as always, and then I repeat this for the second. Afterwards, the layers have to be fixed upon each other. For this, we are placing 4 bar tacks in total, here on the shoulder seam and below the sleeve here at the side seam. These bar tacks are on the inside and are only sewn through the seam allowances. Normally I do this with the sewing machine, but as my jacket is so heavy and thick, I'll quickly do this by hand. I'm pulling out the spots through the reversal opening. I make sure that the seam allowances are pointing into the correct direction, and then I sew them together with a few stitches. As soon as this is done, I'm finally closing the reversal opening. I'm using a ladder stitch here because this will be invisible later. But of course, if this is not so important for you, you can also close this with your sewing machine. Just stitch tightly along the fabric folds. Now come the last finishing touches. I'm adding a hanger loop in the center back inside. And for this I bought this special chain loop for coats. Because of the high weight of my jacket, I sewed on the loop with really many stitches. And of course I also tried to stitch through the fur part, which is more stable than the lining, so that hopefully the whole construction is stable enough. As a last step, I'm adding hooks and eyes along the front edge. I bought special ones for fur garments, which are a little bit bigger and also covered with thread. On the left side of the jacket, I've added the eyes, which you see me doing here, and I fastened them on different spots. I marked them all in green here. As the front edge of the jacket is at the same time also the center front, it's important that the curve of the eye is right at the front edge. At the other side of the jacket, the right side, I've added the hooks. If you're left-handed, of course, you probably should do it the other way around. The hooks are also fastened on several spots, again marked in green here. And the spot where the hook is bent backwards, this is where you should place it at the center front or front edge. Also right at this curve, I fixed it on the fabric. This is the marking at the total left here. Like this, it's really stable and doesn't move anywhere. Okay, that's it. Thank you for watching the video. The jacket is ready. I hope you've had fun watching this video here. As always, don't forget to like and to subscribe here on YouTube. This helps me a lot as a small creator. And if you'd like to, for more creative content, you can also follow me on social media. The Rebecca Fur series isn't finished yet. There's a 4th jacket pending, but this I'll only sew in next year, perhaps in January or February, because this jacket will be again a little bit lighter, so not for the coldest winter days. And I'm really looking forward to this sewing project. So stay tuned. Again, thanks for being here. I hope to see you very soon to my next sewing video. Take care until then. Bye!